for a situation where, say, you didn't get a good sleep the night before, or you need to have this podcast recording or meeting at a time when you're not functioning highly, how do you feel about hacking that with nootropics, caffeine, and then talk about what you would use as better choices in that realm?
Sometimes when you have to perform in the moment, it's absolutely fine. If there's something that you can take or do that helps you do that, I think that's great. Relying on it consistently, I think, becomes more of a problem. And it's because every nootropic out there, every stimulant out there, you increase performance in one aspect and then you usually decrease performance somewhere else. Now, nootropics are sold to us as being like, well, you improve everything and there's no downside. And it's just not true. I'm sorry. So there's when you look at things like the racetams and these other sort of like classical nootropics, you often see an improvement in one aspect of function, but a decrease in another aspect. Now, if in the moment it helps you do the thing that you need to do and there's no downside because it doesn't help you to do the thing you don't need to do, fine. I have nothing against that. But probably the best example is caffeine or other stimulants. In general, like people who consume caffeine every day, as I do, first thing I do in the morning after I walk the dogs is I make my cup of coffee, is usually most of the benefit you're getting is just like a restoration of normal function because you're overcoming the caffeine deficiency that you've hit at that part in the morning. And again, like, it's not a problem. That's what's happening. When you then use caffeine to increase function, and it's ergogenic, like it improves performance, particularly in non-complex skill sports. So you sprint faster, you lift heavier weights, right? You can work harder in the gym if you take a big fat dose of caffeine. That's pretty well understood. If you then look at cognitive functions, caffeine and most other stimulants, they've looked at things like methylphenidate, some of these other amphetamine type drugs that they use that some people do absolutely benefit from if they have ADHD or related conditions. What they do is two things. They increase sort of the reactivity of the nervous system. So like your reaction time, which is a very, very simple cognitive function, that increases with caffeine and some of these other stimulants. But if you look at more complex functions like response inhibition, like which is like a quick decision-making thing, or working memory, actually they tend to get worse with those stimulants. So stimulants improve simple cognitive functions, but for complex cognitive functions, you become over aroused, right? You're sort of like you can't fully engage in the process because you're kind of like you're a bit too wired. The problem, and I think this is something that comes from a lot of the nootropics research, similarly, or these kind of supplements, is that you think you're performing better, but you're not. And there's similar research in like creativity with cannabis. You think you're more creative, but when you do a task that requires creativity, and then people look at it, they're like, oh no, that's not very creative. So like you feel better, but you're not necessarily performing better. Now, again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you think that you perform better, sometimes you do perform better just because you think you're doing better. But just like all of this is a really long answer to your question to say that most of the time when we use these things, we feel better, but we're not like, if we could like objectively measure our performance, it's not necessarily that much improved. So if you're thinking about, right, you didn't sleep well and you need to do an exam, right, which is a very standard occurrence for students all around the world. Thinking about there are other ways that you could boost your arousal. Like that's the problem, is you have an arousal deficit going into the exam because you didn't sleep properly. Caffeine is one way to do it. With like small amounts are great, or like your habitual amount is great. You kind of get up that deficit, over that deficit. When you're sleep deprived, you do have fewer dopamine receptors in some parts of the brain. That gets restored by caffeine. So when you're sleep deprived, caffeine seems to be more beneficial than just at baseline. But there are other ways to do that. So exercise is a great way to do that. So something up to 20 minutes that's not exhausting, but like going for a jog, a brisk walk, even a couple of sprints, that kind of increases arousal. That's going to improve your ability to perform. Bright light is another one. So getting outside, getting sunlight in your eyes, the way we talked about it. You can also they've used light boxes. So, like a 10,000 lux SAD, seasonal affective disorder lamp that you can sort of like buy. If you can't get outside, you can use those. Cold will do it as well. Really like hyperventilatory breath work, that'll probably do it too. It's just anything that's going to get you going that doesn't necessarily need to come in the form of a pill. That's going to then help you, particularly if you're sleep deprived and trying to perform, that's going to help you sort of make up the difference in the arousal that you get because you haven't slept properly.
Talk to the physiology. Somebody who has a bad night's sleep, whether it be staying up too late, young kids waking you up in the middle of the night, dogs need to pee, whatever it is, talk about what changes happen in the brain in the morning, and then the physiology of caffeine. And then we can pivot into some other things and how that can help.
Sure. So I already I mentioned one, which is, so we're thinking about motivation and engagement, but also learning. Fluctuations in dopamine are critical in that. So sort of like motivation and engagement in something where we're going to learn something. And this is actually why social media is so engaging for us, is because humans are wired to learn from social contexts. So the opportunity to learn from like social information, which is what comes on social media, is right there. So that is automatically quite motivating to us. And then sort of like the variability in the reward we're going to get, right? How many likes we're going to get, how much interactions we're going to get with our posts. This is just like, this is absolutely the dopamine slot machine. And it's one of the reasons, because it's the social aspect that makes it so potentially rewarding to us. And so, but then the other side of dopamine that's really important for learning, and it's something that I didn't go into a lot of detail earlier, is that when we make mistakes, that is one of the biggest drivers for learning. And when we make a mistake, actually dopamine drops. So it's actually a dopamine drop that's important, that helps our brain learn something, because it's like, oh, I expected this thing to happen and it didn't happen. And then that also drives learning. So it's not like we want to always find ways to have more dopamine. Sometimes like less dopamine is good, and making mistakes is actually really good for driving that process. But where this comes to sleep is that some parts of the brain, dopamine receptors are down-regulated when we're sleep deprived. So that's where, and that seems to be some of the part of where caffeine can overcome bits of sleep deprivation, is because it then upregulates, or it sort of normalizes or brings your dopamine receptors back to normal, so that you can kind of respond to these aspects of the environment in a normal way. The other part, which is sort of like the classical effect of caffeine, and is related to the dopamine aspect too, but sort of more broadly, is that when our brains are doing anything, when they're awake, they're producing metabolites due to the metabolism of just like doing their daily stuff. And one of the metabolites they produce is adenosine. And adenosine binds to receptors on other cells, and it decreases their metabolism, essentially. So adenosine is something that builds up during the day, and it's part of that switch over to sleep, as part of what we call sleep pressure. So just the process of being awake builds up metabolites like adenosine that help to then create the environment for sleep. So the next morning, if you haven't had a full night of sleep, you haven't been able to clear out all the stuff that accumulates, one of those things is adenosine, then you've still got some adenosine kicking around, and caffeine is an adenosine antagonist. It binds to the receptor for adenosine so that it can't bind to those cells and decrease their metabolism and function. So that's two ways that when you're sleep deprived, it affects the way your brain functions, and that caffeine can overcome that.
The adenosine piece was the part I was fishing for. And
yeah,
the part I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
When it comes to caffeine, specifically coffee in the morning, how do you feel about specifics of hacking that? I've heard different things, like waiting a certain period of time once you get up to have a better effect of that caffeine. And I've also heard grinding the beans fresh makes a difference. So anything in those realms or other that we can use as hacks for our coffee or caffeine in the morning?
So I've heard that thing about delaying caffeine as well. Like some people are concerned about, well, they're like, well, when you first wake up, you're going to be awake anyway, so then you don't necessarily need the coffee. Other people have said that, you know, right in the morning, your cortisol peak is high, and then like you add a bunch of stimulants on top of that, and that can maybe mess with your blood sugar. Like theoretically, that's possible. Like when you do drink coffee, in general, your caffeine does increase your blood sugar like a little bit. That's just, but I don't think that's a bad thing. It's just, it is what it is. There was a recent review paper that kind of dug into the literature on this idea, and basically there's very little evidence that says that you should delay your caffeine intake. It's much more to do with what makes you feel like you can function at your best. So if you wake up in the morning and you can do a couple of hours of high quality work with no coffee, but then things start to drop, but you still need to work, right? Then maybe that's when you have your cup of coffee. If you wake up and you're sort of like bleary eyed and you can't really understand what's going on in the world, then maybe coffee first thing is going to help you there. So I think I would just time it to your natural rhythm so that you can take advantage, maybe if it gives you a little boost, but obviously make sure that it's not so late in the day that it then affects your sleep. So big doses of caffeine, particularly after around midday, tend to negatively affect sleep that night. So I would just do it based on your own personal preference. I don't think there's like an automatic hack in there. In terms of grinding the beans, so then there's also like the roasting of the beans. So darker roast coffees tend to have a slightly higher caffeine content on average. Like Arabica beans tend to have slightly lower caffeine content compared to Robusta beans. Like all of this is you're sort of welcome to tinker with, but I would kind of say it probably doesn't really matter that much. I grind my beans fresh every morning because I'm a bit of a coffee snob. So that's like part of my routine. But you know, you can take instant coffee from Robusta beans and get 99.9, as long as you enjoy it and it does what you need it to do, that's fine too. Sorry, I don't have any hacks.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
This traditional idea that eating lots of carbs, that spikes lots of insulin, and then that causes insulin resistance, in and of itself, I don't think that that's actually what's happening. As people become metabolically unhealthy, or they become insulin resistant, there does seem to be this